Let's be honest, most of us know the importance of physical health or the importance of keeping our physical health or fitness, however you want to talk about it. But why is it so stinking hard to maintain our healthy habits, especially if you're a busy professional? If you are a high performer or busy professional and you want some tips and skills and some better habits for your health and fitness and your goals, this episode is for you. Today I talk with Olly Wood, an amazing trainer and the founder of the Meta Project, and we go deep in kind of uncovering some of the habits of professionals, how we can integrate into busy lives, why burnout is such a big deal, and really understanding stress in a different way, really looking at stress in terms of what is causing, what are the stressors, and quite frankly, why some of diets and health advice is just flat out wrong. So stay tuned to this episode of Go Reflect Yourself podcast. Hi there, my name is Heather J. Kreider, and I welcome you to the Go Reflect Yourself podcast. I'm here to bring you real, practical, brain-based strategies helping you transform your life one thought at a time. Working hard and staying busy will only get you so far. To truly become happy, content, and who you're meant to be, you have to move beyond physical capacities and look from within, allowing you to overcome those obstacles and barriers. My mission is to help inspire you to take massive action to transform your life, all starting from the inside out. I invite you to watch or listen to this podcast and share it with others who you feel can also benefit from it. I invite you to join my free Facebook group, Beat Burnout. That's where we provide more practical neuroscience and mindset strategies, helping you reduce stress, anxiety, and overcome overwhelm. Thank you so much for being here. I'm honored and grateful for you.
You are stronger than you believe. You have greater powers than you know.
Let me tell you a little bit more about Olly Wood, the founder of the Meta Project. Olly is not just a fitness trainer. He is a big picture thinker. He understands how your physiology and looks at more than just the fad diet or the, quite frankly, what I would call the normal fitness trainer routine. But a little bit more about Olly. He came from a small town in New Zealand and was brought up on homegrown real food, which is amazing. He grew up and saw how the food industries changed and realized many issues were brought back with a lack of real nutritional focus and how much food alone can rebuild the body and health. He got his start in the trenches of the health world as a personal trainer in a big box gym. And after working for 7 years, primarily with high performing business owners, saw the real extent that stress, inflammation, and a lack of focus on recovery was ruining progress. Olly focuses his peak performers on the power of nutrition along with his team of experts in areas of mental health, nutrition, biochemistry, and training with a guiding philosophy: you can only push as hard as you recover. Olly's goal is to help professionals on the pursuit of growth and improvement to make sure they don't leave their body and energy behind. And with this framework, can change the way people fuel and nourish their bodies for good. All right, Olly, welcome to the Go Reflect Yourself podcast. Thank you so much for being a guest with us today.
Yeah, awesome, Heather. Good to finally get it set up.
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I talked briefly a few months ago, and we really were focusing on the importance of brain health. Obviously, all of my work really heavily focuses on brain health and how it relates to performance, not only performance, but stress management and just being able to function at a high level. I want to jump right in for you straight away to if you can answer what are the most common pitfalls busy professionals make when it comes to taking care of their bodies and brains.
Yeah, well, for us, we work in that space so much with business owners and high-performing professionals to look at what are those components that affect how their body function. I think taking into account, if you're already exercising, you're looking at your nutrition and things aren't responding like they used to, then ultimately there's going to be more to play, right? That's what we're looking at here is we've got a foundation of eating healthy. Now, what do we take into account as optimizing that sequence to make sure you're actually getting the results? So for me and finding that space, it's very much been a case of looking under the hood and finding what are the other components there. And stress, as you said, being a really, really big one. But where is that stress ultimately coming through? And there's really three areas that we'll dive into there. Whereas one, we've got your psychological stress, right? Two, we've got our physical stress. And then third, we've got our digestive stress. So ultimately, the topic comes back to what you've already said, which is stress, but it's finding out and pinpointing where that's coming from for you, right? If we're going to break down those three areas, then one, that psychological can be, the work deadline. It can be some sort of home friction. It can be whatever that space is where that mental chat is not really optimal. The second one from a physical aspect is, yes, it can be stressful if we're not actually moving enough, if we're just sedentary all the time, but also the other end of that spectrum where we see both men and women trying to exercise like they did in their 20s or they're seeing their body slow down, so they're doing more and more. And that's becoming a physical stress that is causing ultimately less results. But then we have our digestive component as well, right? Where we're really looking into that inflammatory response to certain foods we're eating, that sort of stress around eating and not digesting foods properly, whether that's a case of eating on the run, not chewing food properly, or simply the selection of foods we're looking at. I think it really falls under that umbrella of stress, but it's ultimately finding where that's coming from for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting it. I really like being able to pinpoint it in those buckets. Yep. And everybody's life is different, but clearly those three things affect us. It's just depending upon the level. I want to pick up on something that you said. My birthday was yesterday, so I'm really feeling the effects of getting older, and I'm not going to say my age, but I claim to be 29 again. But it is different. And most of my listeners and my clients really are 40 and above. Mm-hmm. And there's truth to it being different and not pushing our bodies to the way that we were able to when we were in our 20s. Can you talk to that a little bit more and why that's physical stress?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's ultimately the demographic that we work with is really ultimately seeing those shifts after 40. And I think importantly, realizing that you are working with an entirely new biology. It's not a bad one. It's just a different biology. So looking at what worked when you were, 21, it's only, 8 years ago for you now, like you said, but taking the time to find out what those changes are like over time, we're trying to find out, well, it's not ultimately having to do less potentially, but it's finding out what that new lever, what that new goal is. All right. A lot of the time it is ultimately that you're doing too much and too much of the wrong stuff. So if, long cardio spurts worked for you and they're not working now, then ultimately what's shifted? If we're starting to notice symptoms coming through at perimenopause and we're starting to notice shifts in hormones, then now we're really taking into account stress, right? Because we're shifting from, our sexual organs doing more of the work to more of our adrenal glands, right? So ultimately, it's directly down to stress. And even if you are still having regular periods, or as a man, you're still noticing your energy is good from a hormonal standpoint. If you are stressed out, and if you are stressed out for long periods of time, there's something called a pregnenolone steal, which is ultimately you producing stress or producing sex hormones. You can't produce both at the same time. So ultimately you have that switch there, and you have the ability to really double your hormone production through addressing that stress at a high level. And it's the same as toxicity in today's environment, right? That's in the air, it's in the water, it's in the food, it's everywhere. We're not going to remove it entirely. It's the same as stress. But if we can be aware of some simple strategies there to ultimately improve it and be aware of how much of our day is that navigating, we can certainly make a really, really big difference in how our body's responding. Because like we've just talked about, is even if you're doing the healthy things, if you're not taking into account that stress component and how that's impacting you as you get older, it's only going to really show more and more. All right, we could dive into it's harder to recover. There's more muscle breakdown that we need to address. We've got to realize that all of these other components, but really that stress, as we've sort of started today's conversation, is going to be a really nice one to tackle, and ultimately understand what hormones, organs, whatever that might be, that it's really stressing out to build that body back up. And that's really the process that, the one question, if we can ask around your health journey is your pursuit to better health in the ways you're doing it through exercise or whatever, is it breaking you down or is it building you up? Right? If you're following a diet that's allowing you to drop weight in the short term, but you feel terrible, it's breaking you down, right? If you're doing more and more cardio, but you feel terrible and it's breaking you down, is that helpful? All right. So we're looking at making those shifts to working with that new biology and ultimately finding out what are those key building up blocks for you through exercise, nutrition, and those other components we can look at to really make sure we're working with you.
That's brilliant. And it, when we talk about the brain, it's very intimidating and it sounds very complicated, but everything you just said relates directly to our hormone production, how we are affecting, and we haven't even talked about sleep, and that's a whole other long conversation. But the point remains is, instead of being intimidated by the brain, by the changes that our biology is actually going through, by the environment we're in, start with simple things and just looking at your day-to-day choices. So you said, again, everything is brilliant, and clearly we could take one of those tiny topics and pull a thread that could last for days. But let's talk about busy professionals, because what we were taught, and so I'll go back to what you said, very often in our younger ages, it's very easy to eat poorly, recover quickly, do a ton of cardio, and feel pretty good. But as our body changes, as our lifestyle changes, as everything starts to affect us, we're flat out just really busy. And so now we're even more intimidated by incorporating the things we need to incorporate. So if I come to you, or another professional comes to you and says, look, Olly, I'm exhausted, I don't have any energy, I know my hormones are changing, but I don't have time to figure all this out. What's the simple things to start with first?
Brilliant. And this is an area, this is exactly why we work with high performers, because they get it. They just don't apply it to their health. And the big things we look at is the aligning of those goals, right? If Heather focuses on attention to detail or consistency in her business, but she doesn't do it with her health, how about we look at aligning those and realizing it's going to really make both better, right? So I think aligning those values, those virtues can be a really good way to start that conversation, because I can't give you that 25th hour in the day, but I can look at improving how you approach fitness. And I think sometimes it is really going from a mindset of your maximizer to your optimizer, right? We're doing all the things and seeing what sticks. Now we're moving to what's that one thing that we can really utilize, move to move the levers, right? And I think taking that time to ultimately just address that can be a really good way to look at the overarching mindset first before diving into the weeds. And we talk about this with my coaching team all the time, is taking the time to realize that emotion is a part of us. We're working with human beings. But if we can ultimately bring it down to logical steps and find that first domino, then we can start, as you said, pull the thread and see how far it goes, because we can really start to see where we're burning the candle at both ends. And potentially it can be, especially as business owners, it can be a lot of a control component, right? What are we delegating at work? And ultimately, what are we not delegating that is holding on to more of that stress? Is that a case of the best value of your time? Is it really taking into account the long-term picture, right? If we get really busy, it's quite easy to put a head down and just get right into things. But if we look 6 months from now, is our approach in business or health actually sustainable long-term? So taking the time to look at that approach of, if you keep doing it this way, right, you'll get the project done, but what's the long-term outcome of our health or even our productivity, right? I had this conversation with someone just yesterday. If it's just something you need to do in 2 weeks, then awesome. A couple of things will slide. You've got a priority shift. Let's get that thing done. But if this is your new way of living because you've got a promotion and now you're taking on the role of 3 different people, which we see so often, how long does that work until it no longer does? Until you start to feel run down, until you start dreading that alarm in the morning, until you start forgetting things and you've got that brain fog, so you can't actually function at the high level you were promoted to be at, right? This is where we need to be a little bit more proactive with our health, and realizing that taking the time to anchor those steps in first is going to allow us to be more productive and ultimately enjoy that process more. So I think that assertiveness, that clarity around long-term vision, it's going to apply in both areas, whether that be business or health. It's taking the time to ultimately look at the long-term goal and just extend that goalpost a little bit more. Is it the short-term 5 kilos you need to lose this week? Or is it really ultimately feeling awesome in your own skin and being able to do the job you want to do?
Yeah, no, I love that approach. And Again, we are in a society, and you see this probably way more than I do. People want the quick and easy, just give me the pill, give me the magic formula or magic button, and not really make long-term changes to their daily habits and routines. And that's really what it's about. It's taking a look at the big picture and saying, what am I doing every day to contribute to my goals in general? This isn't just about my health. It's about every key area of my life. And that's really what I see when I deal with high performers is it's usually very, very carved out of one particular area of life. And that's usually it. All the other things kind of fall to the wayside. So from that perspective, let's talk about brain fog, because that's a huge key component to when we really look at the contributor to long-term burnout, really that overarching stress, because that's when we start pushing. Most people push because I can't figure this out. I'm tired. This brain fog is really affecting me. So then our habits usually get worse at that point. How would you talk to brain fog in particular?
Yeah. So for us, it's ultimately looking at as one symptom among many symptoms that are going to come through that is a signal, that engine warning light coming up that your body is not functioning the way it should. So ultimately looking at that and addressing that not as this is the problem, but ultimately what is the ultimate picture we're looking at? We need to function as a high-functioning human, and there's something getting in the way. Is it the oil change? Is it the tire that needs to be adjusted on that car to take the time to really build that body back up? So the first place we address is ultimately we keep a broad sort of goal of it being health anchors. Where's that coming up in your life? So again, looking at one of those three stresses, is it psychological, physical, or digestive? And for us, if we can really look at building up that health base first, as we talked about earlier, the goal is long-term, yes, but it doesn't mean we can't have short-term wins, right? So if the goal long-term is losing a certain amount of weight, or ultimately where we're going is how can we add 10 years to your life, right? Not just quality, but quantity. And that's where we're actually tracking those markers to get an idea of, okay, you're someone's 52 right now, but we're finding that you're functioning as a 57-year-old, or maybe you're feeling 70. Taking the time to bring that back down to your actual chronological age can be something that becomes a really rewarding long-term goal. But what that looks like in 6 months, a year from now, is not necessarily motivating when we can't get up today for the gym, right? So taking the time to find that in the short term can be really, really helpful to realize that if we focus on health first and building that base, we're not just ultimately building up that long-term goal. In the short term, we're ultimately building up that energy, right? We're building up that mental clarity. We're sleeping through the full night. All of those components that we really start to see as smaller wins on a day-to-day basis. So brain fog, although we're not addressing it directly, I think that's important to realize is that we're not addressing just a symptom. We're looking at the root cause of those problems. And if we look at functioning the body as a whole, we start to realize that that's going to have a direct impact on the brain. And realizing that, as an organ in comparison to everything else in the body, it's using a substantial amount of energy, right? So it's using a lot more than other organs of that size. So taking the time to realize it's just giving you those signals that potentially your body's not working like it should.
Yeah, that's huge. And that's why I love how you approach it, because most people, like I said, they just want the quick fix. Let me go on a quote diet. Let me do something very short term. And that actually has worse effects on our brain health, because now our brain's being deprived, and now it makes that brain fog and that energy even worse. So that's one of the really burning questions that I really wanted to ask a professional like yourself is, why are those quick fix diets so detrimental to the long-term goal?
Yeah, well, I think the best quote we can use there is be careful on the goal you choose because you might hit it, right? And I think taking the time to realize that if you're getting that short-term 5 kilo weight loss, but it's a detriment to your energy, your brain fog, and all these other things coming through, well, really, ultimately, was that the goal? And from what we've found come through, it's never the goal, right? Just the 5 kilos, that weight loss is never the only goal. It's ultimately how we're feeling and functioning in our own body. And I think as we get into our older years, we start to realize that's more and more about what our body is capable of and how we feel on a day-to-day basis. So we don't have to think about it. rather than necessarily making sure that we have those six-pack abs, right? It's kind of cool, but it's not the main goal. So taking the time to look at that in more of a holistic view requires a bit more of a holistic plan. And I think if we start to look at these as short-term fixes, we get it logically, but emotionally, we still want that quick win. So the way we approach it is making sure that if you front load your health and you build that awareness of, okay, what are ultimately the things that we can get on a short-term basis, allow you to buy in, allow you to lean into this process so that long-term you both achieve that and the long-term outcome you're after. I think we get more of a win-win, but it just becomes a bit more of a bigger conversation, right? If we just look at growing revenue in a company, but we don't take into account profit, and we start to realize that we're spending a lot on ads and not seeing the return there, then potentially we're growing the top line, but we're completely ruining the function of the business. Or maybe we're growing the business so hard that fulfillment's dropped, right? And now we're seeing that we're spending so much more because our quality of the product has dropped. So everything aligns back to business. And I think just taking the time that if you are in that space of trying to manage both the values or questions you should be asking are exactly the same.
That's an awesome way of looking at it, and a great parallel, because why would you run the different parts of your life any differently? You've got the knowledge, you've got the understanding, so apply it in the way that makes sense.
Yep.
So why aren't people doing that then? Why is it so difficult? Is it because of the desire for that instant six-pack abs and then the frustration that you don't have it?
A phrase I seem to be saying quite a lot lately is humans are solar panels with emotions. So I think taking the time to look at all of the components that come into people's health, I think it's just taking one step at a time. And I think we can get frustrated as, if you dive into any space long enough, and I'm part of plenty of masterminds and different coaching groups to know every industry has their flaws, right? Mm-hmm. And everything has something to be worked on. But ultimately, life is all about selecting the problems that you want to solve, right? If you don't have any problems, you get really bored really quickly. So I think just being aware of what those are and being happy with the problems you have selected to solve is kind of a good way to start. So for us, I'm in love with the customer we work with, right? So everything we do is about serving that customer the best we can. And taking the time to understand that customer is going to be a big part of that process. And I think if we can go through that and just break it down and realize that we are emotional creatures, even if we seem to be logical on the outside, I think it's just a case of when we work with individuals, we start to look at things like their day, right? Rather than diving into nutrition, I want to say, well, what does your day look like? Where is this going to fit in the first place? Because if you've got the perfect nutrition plan, but it can't fit into your life, it's no longer the perfect nutrition plan. So ultimately, taking that time to fit in those initial tweaks or adjustments becomes a big part of that conversation. And that's why we're in that high value space. Rather than just giving you a program, it's taking the time to look at that as an individual and ultimately look at the lifestyle being the biggest part of your health pursuit.
That's huge. That's huge. And what a beautiful gift too, because you can pick up any book and learn a lot. There's plenty of resources out there. But each individual is different, each individual's life, their history, their habits, their goals. Everybody is unique, even though there's some pretty common and basic things, even in certain foods, the way it affects our brain, certain supplements, etc. But I love that approach because it's saying, okay, you as the individual, how can we make something that actually works for you? Because it's about having results. It's not, like you said, quick wins are great, but it's not sustainable. And we get those dopamine hits too. And so it's balancing that. It's balancing those quick dopamine hits so we do feel good, but then how do we sustain that so we have repeated results? So I love that approach. I'm going to go back because every professional, you already said it, even though logically we get it, still that emotional part's, we're going to fight the emotional part. Most professionals are going to say, I just don't have time. I don't have an hour to work out. I don't have an hour to meal prep every day. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I got a simple question for you. When will you have time? Because most people won't give you an answer. If you're 60, and that's when you've got time, I think you've waited a little bit long, right? You can still do it then, and we've certainly made some huge turnarounds at 60. But I think sometimes just taking, if you want to reinforce those stories, then great. We can play that game. But it's really taking the time to look at, I need to make sure you have a desire to want to change. And if you want to believe your stories rather than your ability to move, then, well, that's the first obstacle we've got to look at, not your health. All right. And I think too many coaches will be like, oh, yeah, totally. We can work with 2 minutes a day that you can exercise. Okay, well, what happens with the other, 23 hours and 58 minutes? Taking the time to look at that space and ultimately look at addressing the root problem, which is we don't value ourselves enough. And we let everyone else lock in what we need to do in a day. We don't block in time for us. Then all of that time is going to get pushed. And if we don't take the time to look at that and address us as humans and what we want out of our life, I think now, again, we're taking the time to step back, look at the full picture of when are we going to have time? Because if we don't you think we should address that first? Right?
Oh my gosh. Now you're speaking my language. One of the pillars of what I call the pillars of reflection is values. Mm-hmm. And if you can start to unwind first and really see where you have your value, what stories you're telling yourself, what are those constant mind movies, those constant thoughts, those are the things that are, I'm stuttering because there's so many wonderful things and ways we could take that, but it all starts with the way we think, what we believe, what we see of ourselves. And those stories are huge. And honestly, most people don't really take the time to understand that. So that's where self-reflection really is a huge part of this. I've got to have a good hard look in the mirror and say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is honestly where I'm at. But this is also, these are my thoughts, these are my stories, and these are the things that have contributed to me being right here today. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad, but does it serve me? Now, how can I make changes moving forward? So I love that you looked at the mindset of that first, because that's enormous.
Two ways I'd love to just comment on there, because it is really, really big. Is one, it's taking the time to look at the person you're working with. I'm not buying that story, right? Apart from the president, I've worked with all the people that I know what they do, right? You've got the $100 million companies, you've got the mid-level manager and everything in between. Like, I know what's required of those roles, and it's hard. I'm not saying it's not, but ultimately every single one of those levels is still the same amount of hours in the day. So there has to be an intentionality behind what you do in a day. And I think just realizing that I'm not buying that story, and if you're willing to reinforce that more than actually being willing to change, then we've run into our first obstacle. And I think just being aware as you're not doing your job as a coach if you are not addressing that first, right? If you're just trying to walk around the outsides and how we can improve the 2 minutes that you have in your day, well, we're really not addressing the big thing. So I think sometimes conflict is required for change. And I think sometimes it's those internal stories in every area of life that we need to address first, anything to actually happen, all right? And then the second part that you brought up, which is the values aspect, is realizing that if we look at your bank account, we look at your calendar, we look at all these areas, we can get a pretty good idea of, you can tell me what your values are, but if we look at those things, we can really tell you what those values are, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of time, they're not very aligned with what you think they are. So taking the time to just make those shifts towards, it's not going to happen overnight, it never does, but what is one thing we can do to move closer to that? It needs to start with you reinforcing a new story.
100%. I love that that's where you start. And that's with everything. Mm-hmm. That's every key aspect of your life. And when you're looking, I always look at things from a fulfillment perspective. And it's not being 100% euphoric at every moment, because that's impossible, but it's being able to bounce back quicker and being able to have an honest look. And that's why having a coach is a huge, huge component of that. But not just any coach, a coach that's going to be able to really look at it from an objective perspective, but be honest. And it's not, I like the word that you used, but I also would extend it. There needs to be conflict, but I think it's more of candor and honesty, because you're not paying coaches such as you and such as myself to tell us what we want to hear. We need some honesty from a pure professional perspective. Otherwise, you're just wasting everybody's time. Mm-hmm. So can you explain a little bit about the Meta Project? That is your company. Explain a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, pretty much everything we're talking about today is a component of health, right? And it's taking into account that there's more to it than macros and dumbbells. That's really ultimately the goal. And if we think that we're eating healthy, but our body's not shifting, then what else are we not addressing? And I think just taking that account and looking at these three core stresses, right? Our psychological, our physical, our digestive, we start to address the bigger picture. So for us, we don't talk about or add in structured training to at least week 3 or 4 of the program, because we need to look at those foundations. And considering we haven't talked about the sleep component, but if we're looking at sleep, nutrition, training, and mindset, or that lifestyle design component, we really need to take into account all of those, right? So we really start to look at this as, okay, if we're just looking at training, but where that's not communicating to how you're sleeping, how you're eating, or potentially that mental chatter that's going on, we're ultimately missing the bigger piece of the pie. So allowing what we've constructed becomes that congregation of specialists in those 4 areas to make sure that that is being addressed, and you're having that entire process being catered to you as an individual. Now we're really starting to put the bits of the puzzle together and get an idea of what's allowing us to build you back up, right? We start to look into blood work and get an idea of what are some of these deeper markers that may be normal, but they're certainly not optimal, right? How are we taking the time to build you back into a range? How are we looking at that lifestyle to realize where are you sabotaging your ability to move forward, even though you're working hard, right? Where do we make this easier? And then if we start to look at adding an exercise to not only drop the body fat or shift that body composition, but ultimately build that balance, that strength back into a capable body, well, now we're really taking into the bigger picture of health. And I think that sequence and allowing us to really just obsess over that program design, we've had 500-600 people in even the last year and a half go through that process. So we know exactly what parts come up where. And of course, there's an individual aspect because we're talking to them one-on-one on those calls. But if we design that sequence of doing, I know exactly what you need before you even know you need it. We can really start to design that sequence to build your body back up, knowing what's going to happen through perimenopause, what we know is going to happen through that busy season at work, and taking the time to construct a game plan that's taking into account all of those disciplines of health. We're starting to create a picture of bigger awareness, really, of ultimately what's going on.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So I want to kind of go full circle back to food. One of the things that you talked about was real food, real nutrition, and how that affects. And again, these are all topics that really could be very, very deep. But from our society, we eat so much processed food. We have a lot of myths and garbage in our society in terms of what is nutritious. Why do you say that real food is a huge key to brain health?
Yeah. Well, let's focus on ultimately the diversity of nutrients that we're getting in food, right? We can get obsessive about calories or macros even, but if we're not taking into account the nutrients that our body is getting used to, I think we're looking at the biggest problem, the biggest epidemic we're looking at right now is people are over-consuming and undernourished, right? So if we're running into those two things at the same time, that's a pretty major stress on the healthcare system, not to mention you as an individual. Mm-hmm. So taking the time to look at that being our main problem, that's going to not just your brain, but every organ in your body is not going to function as it should if you're not addressing that space. So ultimately, if we look at whole foods, we look at counting colors, not calories, we really look at the space of improving the overall function of the body as a whole. And that just becomes more diversity, more nutrients, more colors in that space. And ultimately just getting back to potentially just grounding our roots of what real food is, right? Everything comes in a packet these days, and we've got all these numbers and letters. And the scary part is we're even getting things like folate or fiber added into foods to hit a certain health criteria, which means that we're now spiking food to make it healthy, right? On top of a food that's already processed. So it really becomes a very confusing space, and it can be really, really challenging to get an idea of what is healthy food, because if it's in a box with a tick, that doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. And it's just taking the time to bring it back to ultimately what's going to fuel your body and get you feeling great.
So as part of your program, explaining that and also making it fun and delicious at the same time?
Totally. You're not going to follow a plan if you don't enjoy it, right? And making sure that if food is bland and you've got your chicken and rice, then you're not going to stick to that, right? So I think taking the time to add in those colors and make sure food is really, really tasty. I think we've got about 3 or 4 of our coaches on board have all been past chefs. So taking into account all of that space of how can we walk you through how to make really good food in a really short amount of time, that's going to be the 2 balance points that we bring together. How do you enjoy it, and how can we do it quickly? That's how we're going to stick to it.
That's huge. And that's kind of the summary of everything. There's no need to go on and on unless you just really want to research or become something different. But that's kind of the key in all areas of life is high quality, make it quick, make it efficient, but quality at the same time. We don't have to linger and anguish over things.
Yeah, and I think that, again, we're leaning back into the stories that we tell ourselves about food, right? Eating healthy is expensive, eating healthy is time consuming, all of these things. But if we can break those down in the first 2 weeks and realize that the nutrition side of things is really, really easy, you've just got to listen to your body and follow this plan, then that's being built out with you on a call, then we've already got rid of that first obstacle, right? And we can start to find the next one.
Yeah, that's huge. So how can people get in touch with you, Olly?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of places where, anywhere on, Instagram, you can search up Olly Wood, same on Facebook, all the rest. But I think because this has been such a holistic conversation and taking into account all of those components of health, I think something that hopefully if you've really resonated with this audience or this message, it's really going to be, I'd love to give you access to a 5-day challenge walking you through that process. So knowing that there's all of these components of health, we're looking at mindset and finding a bigger goalpost. We're taking the time to, how do we improve your sleep and ultimately balance out your hormones? Or how do we just simplify nutrition and know where to start? I think that could be a really good sequence for your listeners and taking the time to walk through that place. So if you found value from today, you find that's something that we can move forward with, we'll probably chuck the link in the show notes or just go to the metaproject.co. Can be a really good place to potentially just walk you through that process. It's completely free, but it will get you an awareness of some of those steps to maybe start.
That's perfect. And yes, we'll absolutely post everything in the show notes. All links will be included. Any parting words? So I want to first just say, again, this is a holistic conversation. When we're talking about stress, which is very difficult for me to be quiet about because we have such a chronic stress problem. And yes, that's a big word. Yes, it affects all of those key components in different areas. But 2/3 of our workforce have admitted to burnout. And I don't want to go off on a tangent because I'll get frustrated, but the chronic disease that we have, all the things that we are affecting ourselves because of stress, really so much of it is preventable. So from that perspective, any parting words that you might have that can really resonate with people to just take some first steps?
Yeah, I think there's two main ones. One is no one is as smart as everyone. So I think sometimes taking into account that ability to get someone in your corner to help you make those steps is a really, really good place to start. But ultimately that comes to our second point, which is you can't hate yourself into shape. It has to come from a place of love. It has to be something that you respect yourself enough to do. And for you to just take that first step out the door to go for a walk, whether that's you looking at addressing your health issues and hiring a coach, it does have to come from a place of you wanting to get more out of your day, out of your life. And I think if we can start to simply shift that mentality of not what I used to be and what I'm getting back to, but what can I become? And just really shifting that space of where I'm going and making sure you're really aware of that mental chatter because it can very, very easily be negative and start to build ourselves back up. Like we talked about with the exercise, it can break us down and build us up. Very much the same with our words. And I think if we can just look into that as a pursuit of self-love or self-respect, we start to see the obstacles as potentially next steps for us to move forward and ultimately just being able to get people in our corner to help us out, or ultimately if we're on that pursuit together or by yourself, taking the time to realize that needs to be compassionate and that will allow you to enjoy it, that will allow you to keep going. And I think just all the things we talked about today, I don't have time. Do you really think that comes from a place of self-love?
That's huge. Self-love and compassion is by far one of the biggest components. And we, especially in our society, we're just not taught those things. And that's the last thing that we look at. So thank you for bringing it back to that, because that's huge. That's a huge awareness. And the book I've been recommending to everybody lately is Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. And it really boils down to everything you just said. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it here. This is a lovely conversation, great questions. And I think just understanding the bigger picture of health that we can take into account. If your body's not working, there's so many things that you can take into account. But more importantly, what's the one first step you're going to take, not all of them?
That's it. One step at a time. That's all you can do. Oh my gosh. Well, Olly, it was an absolute pleasure. I definitely think that we probably could extend this conversation in a lot of different directions, but I think this is a great overview. And just from the perspective of what's that one step, but more importantly, really just looking at your life and how your actions come from your thoughts, how everything is affected by what you put in your mouth, not just in what you're saying, but what you're eating. It's all related. So thank you for that overview and your wisdom. Like I said, we'll absolutely post everything in the show notes, but I just so appreciate your time today.
No, thank you so much. That was good.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Go Reflect Yourself. Please rate and review this episode, and if something moved you, please feel free to share. For more inspired action or to stay in touch, head on over to goreflectyourself.com or heatherjkreider.com. You can also take the growth mindset quiz and learn where your current growth mindset lies. Stay in touch on all social media at Heather J. Kreider. Until next time, this is your host, Heather Kreider, and I am challenging you to go reflect yourself so you can discover and become who you are meant to be.